I taught the basic survey of United States history at Palomar College from 1998 through 2016. 18 wonderful years. When we came to the period of World War II, I reminded one class that Tom Brokaw's book and miniseries had popularized the idea that the generation that dealt with economic depression and won World War II was the greatest generation that America has produced. I also told them that the World War II pilots of our own area met for breakfast every Wednesday morning at a Denny's restaurant in Oceanside. I asked them if they would like to have breakfast with some of our local heroes of World War II. They enthusiastically agreed to hold one class with the pilots at a no-host breakfast, so I began to work on a special history class field trip. The field trip had to be cleared with the Palomar administration, with the restaurant, and with the pilots themselves. When it was finally approved by all concerned, the students drove individually to Denny's and arrived at 7 a.m. This unique event was covered as a news item by the Palomar College student newspaper and later as an editorial in the North County Times. After our field trip, I spoke with Pat Hahn, the station manager for Palomar College TV. I asked Pat about making a television program with the pilots. Pat enthusiastically agreed and began arranging for the use of a studio at Oceanside Community Television. He also chose a narrator for our program from the staff of KOCT. I, in turn, took care of the logistics of assembling a few of the pilots in the KOCT television studio, and Pat supervised his class in the production of our broadcast DVD. I believe we have captured something very precious. All of the pilot participants in our program have now passed away. So here are the stories of a few of our local heroes of the greatest generation.
We're going to ask that question. Hi, welcome to our show, Heroes of the Greatest Generation. For the next hour or so, you're going to join me in having the privilege of spending some time with four guys who had the right stuff at the right time in history. And even though I know they don't like to think of themselves as heroes, they are. They participated in events that changed world history forever. They put an exclamation point on what we now call the American century. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. I'd like to go around and have each of you introduce yourself. And Bud, we'll start with you.
Okay, I'm Bud Miller, and I was with the 1st Fighter Group, 94th Fighter Squadron, the old Eddie Rickenbacker hat and ring. And I flew over out of Italy, most of it over Romania. Flew 53 missions, and credited with 5 kills.
Rod?
Yes, I'm Rod Braswell. I live in Oceanside now. I was with the 456 Bomb Group in close to Foggia, where Bud was stationed also, but I was flying 4-engine bombers where Bud was flying the single-engine fighters. And I flew all the way from France, clear across into southern Germany and into Romania quite a few times, and also in support of the troops in northern Italy. And I did fly the 50 missions without being shot down, and I don't even have a Purple Heart.
Well, we'll go to someone who does. Norm?
Norm.
By coincidence?
Norm Aiken. I was a P-51 pilot, flew with the 4th Fighter Group, 334th Fighter Squadron, was eventually shot down close to Hanover, Germany, when I was escorting airplanes like that young gentleman over there was flying, and spent some time in Germany as a prisoner of war and eventually escaped, got back to the United States.
And Bill?
I'm Bill Ryherd. I flew B-26s, which is a twin-engine bomber, medium bomber. And I made D-Day, and I flew 35 and a half missions. I was shot down on the 36th one over a little town of Chartres, just about 50 kilometers, 75 kilometers south and west of Paris, bombing a bridge. And on August 4th, 1944, my plane set fire. I bailed my crew out and decided I would go, and I landed, and I evaded capture for a few days, or for several days, got in civilian clothes, got into Paris, was sold out by the underground, and went from there into Buchenwald, the death camp there. Stayed there 3 months before they got word that we were actually 82 Americans in there, and they got us out to the prison camp, Stalag Luft 3, and then we rode the war out, marching between the rest of the prisons in Germany.
Wow. Well, I can see the challenge of the show. Each one of you have said 2 or 3 things I'd like to talk about for 5 or 6 hours each. But first, I want to give you a chance to address a subject which we were talking about just before we came live on air, and that is this concept of the greatest generation.
Well, I'll jump into it because I have some strong feelings about what went on and have thought about it a lot. And I've read that book very carefully that Tom Brokaw wrote, and then reread it very carefully. And basically to see if I could fit into what he was talking about. And I concluded finally that certainly we were a different generation, but that was the way we were brought up and the war we were in. Through the Depression for 11 years and then into the greatest war that has ever existed, there were 16.5 million in uniform and 120 million civilians backing us up. And we came out of the war very patriotic and very, very national and very positive that we wanted to get on with life. And that's what we did.
Let me say that I agree with what Norm is saying, because when Pearl Harbor broke in December, in December of '41, I was in my second year of college, and I couldn't wait to complete the 2 years, which was just in a couple of months, so that I could join the military, and that's just what I did. I broke up my college education to get into the military, and figured that I could take care of the other 2 years at a later date. I did want to be in the Air Force, or Air Corps at that time, and so that's what I signed up to do. I signed into the Army Air Corps and raised my right hand and took the oath, and they said, there's so many people ahead of you that we're going to put you in the reserve on inactive duty, and we'll call you when we have a spot for you to start your training. It took another 6 months before they ever called me to start my training.
Mm-hmm.
Was Pearl Harbor a significant event for all of you in encouraging you to join?
It certainly was for me. As I said, it broke up my education. It was very alarming. My mother was visiting my sister in Virginia. I lived in California, and she and my sister had just delivered a baby, so my mother went to be with her, and so I didn't even have my mother at home with us at the time, and she was very alarmed, and she decided to leave her daughter after the baby was 2 days old and come back to California to be with her family. So it was a very alarming situation when Pearl Harbor came.
It was with me too. Matter of fact, I was a sophomore at Texas at the second year, Texas A&M, which is military, but only because everybody at the 21 had to take military, and it was all boys school. And I'd been visiting a brother of mine down below Houston, and I was hitchhiking, because that's the way we traveled in those days. And nobody passed you without picking you up, and families didn't have 2 or 3 cars. They were lucky to have one apiece. And they always wanted you to ride with them for as company or to help them drive. But anyhow, on the radio that morning, we got the word of Pearl Harbor. That was on Sunday. On Tuesday, Ellington Field, which is the Air Force base at Houston, came up to Texas A&M, about 90 miles north of Houston, and 500 of those boys wanted to join the Air Force that day. I was one of them. I had a year and a half. You needed 2 years, but I'd also been to West Park Prep School, so I had enough that I took the exam. You could pass the exam. So I passed the exam, and I got right in shortly after the first of the year, and got started. But I'm going to take an exception right now with this way they're throwing this word hero and greatest generation stuff around. I have no living heroes I have no heroes on this side of the water. My heroes are all over there. If you're going over there like we did and did our duty and came back, we did our duty. If you went over and gave your life, you're a hero. My heroes all have white crosses over them. So I don't like the way they call heroes.
I was a little bit different when the war first broke out in Europe. I thought, well, this is a place for me, but I couldn't get in the U.S. Army Air Corps because of the educational part. I had to have 2 years. Mm-hmm. So I joined the RAF, and I was accepted in the RAF. And then Pearl Harbor came along, and they wouldn't allow me to go to the RAF. So I'm sitting there. Eventually, they lowered it, so if you passed the 2 years equivalent of college, you could get in. Well, that's how I did. I took a test and got in that way. And I thought the war would always be over before I got over there and did my little thing.
Didn't we all?
Yeah. Well, the interesting point that he doesn't mention, but at Texas A&M, University of Arizona, where I had gone, also had cavalry. And with the 1st Cavalry Division, and you had to go take cavalry. And I learned very quickly that I would better fly than ride a horse all the time.
You and me both.
And that's the way I wanted right in the
I had flat
Army
feet.
Air Force.
You know, of all the veterans, the pilots have the most interesting choice in that you're about to embark on 2 very intense experiences. There's the experience of fighting a war, and then there's the experience of aviation, which in and of itself is exciting and intense. And how big was the aviation component in your decision? I mean, some of you, if not all of you, were facing a draft situation, but was it aviation or nothing in your mind?
Well, it wasn't mine. That's all I wanted to do was fly.
Well, let me say that the government did have a program before the war called CPT, Civilian Pilot Training.
Yes.
And I took that course, which led to a private license, and that was about 6 months before Pearl Harbor. So when it was time to think seriously about getting into a uniform, I wanted to be in the flying end of it, as much as I had a taste of it already.
Well, they did the same thing, the University of Arizona. They gave that program, and immediately I took it because I could get off a horse. But the flight training with the first year was at, in the summer at Davis-Monthan Field. And I learned that flying in the summer in Arizona was about the same as riding a Bronco horse. It's just impossible to fly small airplanes.
Yeah, in that heat.
In that heat.
Well, I went through the Depression like the rest of you. Probably more. I'm probably older than most of you, and I think I am. Yeah, a couple of years or 3 maybe, and out in West Texas, in those plains out there, all I had done is chase jackrabbits and catch a few to eat because you had to have something to eat during the Depression. Depression hits people differently in different parts of the country. And you didn't get hungry out there, but you didn't have any money because there was no jobs. Cities had a different type of depression. But I just felt that the boys out in the country like I was came in with a different thinking on the war than the guys that didn't.
I have to tell the quick story here because being from Texas A&M, when I went into the service at Santa Ana Air Base, a squadron of cadets was 240 people, 240 gentlemen. And a group had been sent in from Texas, 240, and one got ill, and they dropped them off in Phoenix, and they put me with the 239 Texans. I had the most miserable life for the next 6 weeks that you could possibly imagine. And, you know, they thought everybody that, they had most of them been out of the county they lived in, let alone out of the state. And they thought we were all just, you know, shouldn't be allowed. Yeah. And one night I lost control and I got up in my bunk and I said, okay, you dirty SOBs, one at a time. Down in the 8th bunk was a guy by the name of Johnny Godbold. Johnny, I've been told, was an All-American end from Texas A&M. Stood about 6'1", probably weighed in about 205. He started up the aisle in his shorts like I was, and I thought, oh boy, the war may be over for you. Came up and spun around next to me and held his hand up and said, no, 2 at a time.
You never had to ask them where they were from. They'd always tell you.
Yeah, that's right.
But just what, you mentioned small plane in Arizona. It reminded me, your first plane was a small plane. We all started in Jenny's, or what was the first plane?
Mine was a Cessna.
Okay.
Excuse me, it was the Piper Cub.
Okay.
A tail-dragging Piper Cub,
Yeah.
2-place.
Yeah. That's what I flew too.
I started at PT-19.
But in the service.
In the service. Mine was in the service. Single engine, looked more like an airplane than what the rest of these started in. It started out looking like an airplane. Didn't have the bi-wing and all this.
You know, Bill, you mentioned about the expectation of country boys maybe being different, and you talked about sort of preparing yourself to getting into uniform, meaning you knew something was coming. You all had expectations about what it was going to be like.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, I don't think I did.
Yeah, oh, well,
I don't think I
no.
did.
But you knew enough about that you wanted to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that if I had my way today, every young boy would have to go through boot camp. Anyway.
Amen.
Okay, you know, on that amen, we're going to take a short break. We'll keep talking here. You'll be rejoining us in a few minutes while we share these experiences with these 4 gentlemen. So now we have 2 things to talk about. We've got Universal. Sure wish I could see that person in boot camp or get that person in boot camp. Welcome back. We got off on the tangent just before the break, and then we continued discussion into the break about the value to a nation of universal conscription, boot camp in effect. You guys seem pretty much in full agreement that that's a plus.
Yes, but I don't necessarily. If we get away from that conscription, everybody should have to attend. But the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, as civilian, military had nothing to do with it. Yet we did the same thing you do. Had that been military, except we had no fighter or anything like that. But we were kind of regimented, and same way like going to a boys' school, Texas A&M. There was no war going on, but nevertheless, the regimentation, the discipline you learned there, how to treat your fellow man, and how to intermingle with each other and get along with people. And you show me today, most of these young people would be a lot better if they'd been there.
I think we can all agree on what what Bill said there.
You know, I don't know how to explain this really, but during the war and before the war, we were all one bunch of people and we got along well with each other. Today, it's so much different. Even take your sports, for instance. There's nobody, you don't, the Dodgers, okay, we used to have the Dodgers and we knew every player on it. Today, it's just money. That's all it is. And things have changed, though, since our time.
Well, there had
And
to.
we used to have a team that you played. That team was there year after year, the same people, the same player. Today, it's how much money can you pay me? I think this has created a problem here in this country, really.
You know, there's another issue that you guys share because of your age, and again, it's a little bit more likely in pilots because the youngest pilot's normally somewhat older than the youngest infantryman. You remember the Depression strongly.
All of
It's
us,
not
I'm
just a
sure.
vague memory. Not that you would wish that on a country, but in retrospect, was it the best preparation you could think of to fight the biggest war?
Let me tell you, I have said this for years. I don't know whether I meant it or not, but I'm careful who I said it to. All this country needs is a good depression, but I don't want to go through it with them.
I never knew there was a depression. Really and truthfully, I never knew there was a depression. I knew we didn't have any money. We never had any money to spend for this or that. We ate good, but it was just a way of life for us. And you didn't see all this gang stuff that you see today. We didn't have that. We went to school, we had the blacks, we had the Chinese, the Japanese. You didn't think of them only as just another student. Today, it's all together.
Yeah, there's a different attitude too. You had your sports. We didn't go out and bulk up our muscles, take all kind of drugs and stuff. You go out and did the hard work, and you hit them head to head, and you got down, you got back up, and did it again.
Do you think that the country's success in World War II impressed upon you and validated upon you the value of your upbringing and your shared experience? Are you different today because of that?
It certainly made the young men grow up in a hurry. I think when I signed up, I was 20 years old, and taking my training, I was 21, and flying combat as an airplane commander at 22 years old. Let me divert a little bit and tell you that I had a flight engineer that was 32 years old, and I took him down in the Adriatic so that my gunners could shoot the duck blinds, because they don't get to strafe when they're 5 miles up in the air, and they always wanted to strafe, so I'd take them down there and let them strafe the duck blinds. And when I got back home, my 32-year-old engineer said that he quit because I was so young and I was so daring that he didn't want to fly with these kids anymore.
You know, you had just to return to something we talked about in the first segment, you had your expectations, and I was just about to ask, and let me ask it now, how different was the reality of training and or combat to your expectations prior to getting in?
I don't think it was any different, at least in mine and in fighter pilot, because we knew what the odds were. They weren't good. And certainly over Germany, until we got towards the end of the war, they were terrible. Turnover was high, mostly from ground fire, seriously, but an awful lot of it. And we knew that turnover was, but you wanted to be a fighter pilot.
You all knew that?
Well, you know, I don't want to hog this conversation, but as far as I knew, none of us ever thought about it, what the odds would or wouldn't be. I never thought about it till one morning in June the 6th, 1944, at the invasion of Europe. And I was flying B-26s. We were supposed to bomb the beaches and so forth and get it ready for the big onslaught which we put on. And we B-26s had Utah Beach is the beach we had, and our briefing officer that morning, about 2 in the morning, he got up there and he said, "We've got 64 planes we're going to put in the air, and we're going to fly, and we've got one group, squadron, that's down to 6 now." That's the only time in my life in the service I thought, boy, those are thin odds, aren't they? before they quit flying. But that's the only time I ever had my conversation, or my thoughts even of you're not coming back or anything like that. We didn't discuss it. Nobody, I don't think, even thought about it.
Does that match your experience?
I don't know.
You
I
didn't wonder, did
don't
you?
think we had the training. We didn't have the time to do the training that we really should have had. And I, as a fighter pilot, I'm only talking about my squadron, but I imagine every squadron was the same. But I would say that 70% of them shouldn't have been up there flying. There were 25, 30% that were fast learners, and they got it. But there were so many up there that just didn't know what they were doing. And I think there was, with all, you knew which one were the good pilots, and you knew which ones you wanted to fly with. But you had no choice. You had to fly with the squadron or the group you were flying with. It. I don't think we had enough training. For instance, my first mission, we're over Vienna, and all at once there's this big old black cloud off of my wing, and I said, now what in the world is that, you know? I saw it long before the squadron leader saw it. Finally he saw it, and boy, we started altitude. I said, you know, they're shooting at me, that's what they're doing. Nobody told me they were ever going to shoot at me. Nobody told me that.
That they were using you.
They're going to shoot the bombers, but they're not going to shoot me. Here they are shooting at
That's the
me.
flak he's talking.
It made me a
got to
believer
think
in a hurry, let me tell you.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think I can remember anything about what the casualties we could expect, and until I got over there and realized that the casualties were heavy, that the losses of our airplanes was very heavy.
Terrible.
Yeah, and of course, where Bud was flying, he didn't go over the targets the way I did.
Oh, that's great.
As flying escort, he would skirt the targets because
We fly around it.
we flew around them,
Over it.
or over one or the other. But
Different altitude.
I had to fly through that anti-aircraft fire, and I've seen shells break so frequently that it was almost a black sky
That's right.
from the powder that from the.
It was a black sky. And,
I'll
and
tell you.
seriously, we would watch you go in there and then count as you came out how many could make it.
Yeah.
It was just unbelievable.
One thing, I admired those
Yeah.
bomber pilots that sit
Absolutely.
there and didn't vary one
One
inch
inch.
going across that target.
When
You
got
knew
a
that there
target,
was-
The
you gotta
fighter
keep that-
pilot, we fly around it.
You got to stay on target if you drop that bomb.
Yeah.
Did you have that? I mean, I'm more used to this with the Marines and the Navy, where each one wouldn't take the other one's job. You know, the Marine says, no way, I want to be caught on a ship, and the Navy guys say, I'll never go on the land. Did you have some of that between the two of you where, you know, you say, I'd never do that because, you know, it's a big plane, it's the target, and you said, I'd never do that, you know, because they have to do something different. Did you have those feelings that you had the best job? Did you go through those thoughts or not?
Diverting just a little bit from what you're talking about, but we had an infantry captain that came back to Air Bomb Group and said that he'd like to just go along as a passenger on one of the missions. And when our group got back and he got off the plane because he wasn't shot down, he said, you can have that flying. I don't want any part of it. I'll go back in the front lines.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to compare between Navy and Air Force. My wife's brother was a carrier pilot, fighters off of carriers. And of course, I was the Air Force on the ground. And we used to talk together, and I used to think, man, I don't want to be out there trying to find that Bobby Carey out there in that black ocean at night. I want to stay on land. So, and I'm sure he felt the same way about us. So, but we've had some thoughts and discussions between different types of flying, like flying on the water, trying to hit those carriers out there versus on land where I got a whole continent to hit.
When you see movies today, not theatrical movies, but the real movies that have been released, and we see more and more stuff gets declassified, and you look at combat footage of what you did, maybe not the exact mission, but in some cases that could be possible. Can you believe you did it when you see the flak?
I don't believe I did it.
Because it looks unbelievable.
It is
I'm
unbelievable.
Sure you realize that.
And I thought that I probably would never fly the 50 missions that I eventually did. there's no way to get 50 missions under my belt and be
No,
rotated back to the
I
States.
agree with you.
Just no, it couldn't happen.
Well, I believe
When
it
we
could have
went-
shot me down.
And it
When
didn't
we
happen.
went to-
Didn't happen to Bill.
We went to rest camp in Isle of Capri. I had a week there, and I had 40 missions in at that time. I never figured I'd finish 50. Boy, we had a ball, and
You
In
lived it up,
Capri.
didn't you? I went to Isle of Capri also for the rest camp,
yeah,
and I lived it up also.
yeah.
The food at the Isle of
One
Capri,
too many was making it.
The loss at Isle of Capri was greater than in combat.
I almost lost my crew over at the Isle of Capri. They didn't want to return, and I couldn't find them when I was over to Naples to take the airplane to go back to my base. And when I got back over there, my CO says, "Now tomorrow you take an airplane over to Naples, and don't you come back until you find your gunners." And I knew the right bar to go to.
Well, see, after 25 missions, we were supposed to have had so many days off to go to Scotland.
Yeah.
25 missions. Well, I went over as a group. Therefore, 25 comes up for everybody. You have to wait your turn. Mine came up on 35.
You know, we're going to take another break. We'll talk about what happened at those rear brake areas during our break. And when you come back, we're going to talk about what it was like to know that the home front was supporting you 100%.
He directed him. And so, as a result, I went the next day on mine. I should have been in Scotland. I let my crew go, took my co-pilot and borrowed a crew, and got myself shot out on this experimental bombing. So mine just happened opposite theirs.
Well, welcome back. Let's address this issue of the home front. Did you guys feel that everybody was behind you, and did it matter?
I felt so. I felt everybody, and I think they don't get the credit they deserve, these people that were here. And along with this, the people that were backing us, my crew chief, for instance. Boy, you couldn't have a better crew chief than I had. You might have one as good, but not any better. He was backing me from the time I got in. The first time I took off, I went down, I run up my engines, checked my props and so forth, and all the paraphernalia you have to do before. When I came back, he says, Lieutenant, he says, don't run those engines up. Gas is your worst problem we have, which was. We were running such long missions. He says, don't run those engines up. Just sit there and idle. When you're ready to go, you push them. They're going to go. I know. I never touched an engine. When I go down there, everybody was running their engine. I'm idling, sitting there. That's how much I believed him. I mean, it wasn't for these type of people and the people back home here.
You're asking about whether we knew that the home front was backing us up. When you know that Ford Motor Company converted their plants to no more building of cars, but to turn out B-24 bombers, and the word that we got was that a B-24 bomber is coming off the assembly lines on the hour, every hour. Every hour there's another B-24 bomber coming off. That means that the home front is doing their part.
They were doing their work.
I wrote a book, and part of the program that I actually wanted to discuss in there and did is that I had worked at Douglas Aircraft one summer before the war, and then visited Douglas Aircraft in 1943. And when I worked there, that was all men. And when I visited my brother that was working there, there was almost all women. And I traveled across the country a couple times by train, going to Florida to fly, and I was treated all the time like a hero. And I just can't say enough about that. And like I said to start with, there was 120 people backing us all the way.
You know, the hardships were shared in World War II because they had to be. We were up against huge pressures to produce. Since that time, we've had the choice to fight wars independent of any impact on the home front because we have that power, that economic power. But do you think we should just because we can? Do you think it's a mistake to have this isolation where life is absolutely normal here, unless you happen to have a veteran in the family?
No, I don't. I don't. Obviously, I feel very strongly that this nation was kick-started in World War II to become the power that it is. Most of us really don't understand the power to the real degree that exists. And if I had my way, the first thing we'd take care of is the politicians in Washington, D.C. and straighten that up. Because if we don't do that, then we're going to have trouble in the future, and as we do today. And so I think that you've got to do something to bring this nation together. And somebody has to have the guts to tell the congressmen and the senators, you can't exist and set your own salary and your own rules and your own everything else. We're going to take over and help you.
Okay.
Well, you had a point, though, when you asked if you're talking about the wars that we go into now versus World War II. The first two wars we had after World War II, both of them were, at that time, I didn't disagree with the wars, but it bothered me that we suddenly stopped and didn't win. It's the first time we started fighting wars without winning them. And I couldn't see fighting a war without winning it. But then later, and I got to look at it more intelligently, every one of those, after the war was stopped at a certain parallel, you'd find that behind that was the communists. So every one of those was necessary. I don't know, I'm not talking about the one now, but you had your red machine coming right up, and we stopped it at, say, in Korea and in the islands down here. But each one of those, when you checked into it, they had red machinery, in other words, Russian communists, at each one of them where they were stopped. So each one of those was necessary to hold it, and we've held those lines since, and if we hadn't have had those, where would they have moved to? So I changed my mind about fighting a war to win it or start to keep them from pushing forward. So I think both the Korean War and the Vietnam War were necessary now that I look at it from looking back on it.
What do you think was tougher, what the guys are doing today or what you had to do? All things considered, not just technology, not just the size of the enemy, but this issue of home front support, this issue of do we go the whole way, do we have clear objectives? You live through one and you're observing the other.
If you remember, the government called the Korean War and the Vietnam War and police action. And I think that was what created a different situation altogether, where the people were not backing the war as much as they would have if it was an all-out war. We didn't have an all-out war with Korea and Vietnam.
That's right.
And we don't have one today in Iraq either. And
We don't have an enemy today, though. We've got a lot of enemies.
But you don't
We
have
can't
them.
identify them.
But they don't have the backing that we had when we were there.
Right.
I'll tell you.
Right.
Half of the people were for them, half the people were against it.
Oh, yeah.
It wasn't
You
like
mean
that during
of the
World War
Americans,
II.
that it's a split.
They're
And
split.
I don't think we're recommending war.
Yeah.
But if we have to have one, then let's go.
Yeah.
Let's go all the way.
Right.
And everybody sticks together like they did in
Yeah.
World War II.
And we elect a guy to be president, and I think you back him until we elect somebody else, rather than spend the rest of your life the opposite party, picking them apart.
Do you think you would have been able to do what you did as individuals, or as a group, if you thought you only had 50% support?
No.
I think we'd had
I
real
think
trouble.
you'd have a different attitude.
Yeah,
I felt we had 100%, and I went with that.
yeah. I think it was so obvious, at least in my experience, throughout the country.
And it was
no
good
matter
to know.
where you were, people were knitting and just everything.
it was good to know that
Yeah.
the people were backing us too.
Yeah,
And
the
all
way.
the women were jumping into these defense plants and,
Yeah.
helping to build the airplanes and the tanks and whatever. So Americans were 100% back of the fighting boys in World War II, where they're not today, and that makes a big difference.
Oh,
I'm sure in
makes-
the minds of the guys over in the foreign countries.
Well, mine too. It's just an upset situation that we're living with. And it can't succeed unless it pulls together in some manner. We're so powerful that nobody's going to sit back and let us exist in the manner that we want. They can't. Unless God comes along and makes everybody straight, so they're truthful and honest. Even in our own Congress, we have people that are cheating.
You know, there's the reality of the situation that you lived and what we're living today. There's also what the media reports.
Yeah.
There's a huge difference in what you gentlemen experienced and what warriors experience today. So how much weight do you give that process? First of all, how much did you know about the overall grand strategy of the war and how it was going at any given time while you were in it?
There was a little newspaper that was printed over in Europe, Stars and Stripes, wasn't that the name of it?
Yes,
Yeah.
Stars and Stripes.
Yeah, and that from time to time would give us what's happening both in the United States and what's happening in the war, where we stand in the war in Europe too, and how the front lines are moving up and so forth, whatever's going on in the war. So we did get some information through that newspaper. We also had, what was her name, Axis Sally, who would give
Axis
reports.
Sally.
She didn't really give you much news other than
Obviously, good music.
it's good music and who got shot down. She knew the names of the guys that got shot down yesterday, and she would publish that on her radio broadcast. But she played the good tunes that all the guys like to hear, the good music.
I was interrogated twice as before I was finally put in Stalag Luft 3. And the first time was a long 10, 12 days of solitary and then interrogation by the leading interrogator, and the book was written. In the United States brought him back to this country after the war and used him in Pentagon training how to interrogate. And then when we were being moved to camp, we were interrogated, another guy and I at the same time. The question the guy asked was, did the United States understand that if the Germans lost the war, we would have to fight the Russians? And he asked me that question just as clear as could be. And a young guy, I didn't have any concept at all that they were our allies at that, as far as I was concerned. So some people knew the problems that existed, and certainly Germany's opinion that
Oh,
was.
yeah. Stalag Luft 3, which is over on the Polish border.
Yeah.
Well, I happened to be in the room in Stalag 3 in the British compound, because it came out of Buchenwald while they scattered us around. And I got in a British compound. And matter of fact, I wound up in the room where the Great Escape, the movie, where that stove, I wound up in that room 6 months after that Great Escape. That occurred in March of '44, and I hit there I got Buchenwald over to Stalag Luft 3 on October the 20th. So, but I've got the same room, and I've got the same room that which the Great Escape occurred in, and I lost where I was going.
We talk about the Russian implications.
These two Poles that were in there, they were flying with the RAF. Looked like Russia was going to liberate us there, you remember. They were coming up, and they stopped to regroup. And the Americans, or we, wanted the Russians to come on in and liberate us, and these two Poles says, no, you don't.
Yeah.
Let's let the Germans move us back and let the Americans liberate us. You've never tasted bad until you've had the Russians with you. So we've seen the Russians both ways. The Germans are much better, even though we're fighting, they're much better than the Russians. And it turned out they were right.
Wow.
It's interesting.
Interesting. It's interesting being a prisoner of war in Germany and knowing what was going on in Japan. And people ask you that question, and they think that they hear from the Red Cross published in '43 an article that made Stalag Luft 3 look like being at the beach in Santa Monica and just a retreat. Well, the Germans were no different than the Japanese. It just depended who they were considering. The way they treated the Russians was exactly the same way the Japanese treated us. And the way they treated the Poles and the French, and even when they got guys like this in Buchenwald, and they didn't know they were American pilots, and Goring wanted the American pilots to be treated properly. And that was fine until we landed in Normandy, and the rules changed. And the Great Escape was the greatest disaster that existed because Hitler put out the order to kill all POWs.
You know, what I want to do, we're going to take a short break now. When we come back, I think we'll explore something that is probably in a lot of viewers' minds right now. What do you think of the movie? And in general, the question about movies that represent what you actually live. So we'll be gone for a minute or two. We'll come back and continue the discussion. About POWs. And welcome back. We're continuing our conversation here. We're trying to decide. We've got two what we think are interesting things to talk about, and we've got movies, and then we've heard, the dirtiest word you can say, which is Buchenwald. So,
well, it was a horrible place.
Let's start with that.
All right. Most everybody gets the idea that it was just for Jews. It was not. It was built when Hitler first took over, and all the people he kicked out, he started putting them in those prisons. The Jews were the ones that were hurt the worst, and they didn't get any better treatment in there. Now, the rest of us, there was 27 nationalities in there where I was. And if you finally got a place to sleep, other than a rock pile on a hill with day and night the same, why you went down and you got these little pigeonholes, and if you all turned together, you could turn over at night. But it was, I've seen bodies go by during the daytime. You could kill a body there as long as you didn't destroy it. It had to be counted at night. But I've seen bodies go by with just a hands in front and a guy behind, and they're just bones and skin. And you could see a finger maybe twitch like that. Well, they were stacked in rows like cordwood. We used to count for nothing else left to do. In a fenced area at the end of the tree that we had, and then they'd send them to the crematorium at night. So anything you ever heard about that place is true. I'll tell you that much.
Did any of you have any awareness that this was going on?
I didn't know what it was. I didn't even know there was such a thing. I got over there.
Well, to some degree we did at Nuremberg, because when they moved the West Camp to Nuremberg in January, they'd had Italian prisoners there, and it was a mess. And there wasn't blankets enough or anything. And guys sleeping on the floor, and it was cold yet in January. And right next to us was a Russian camp, and they were treated even far worse than we were. And so that part of it showed up there. But more listening to these guys and the guys that were in the Great Escape, we got to talk to them. I learned a lot about escaping that I didn't have the slightest idea when I went in there, other than we were told our duty was to escape. And what information they had as how to do this was totally limited.
Let's just spend a brief amount of time. Let's talk about the movies. Let's start with The Great Escape. How close was it to the experience as it was described to you from the people who lived it?
Well, I think, as far as I'm concerned, it was great until towards the ending. It didn't tell what the problem was that they made. It was a tremendous thing that a couple thousand young engineers and talented people did, digging the tunnel and everything. But they got 60 guys or 70 guys out finally in an emergency type thing, and only 2 of them ever got back to England. 3
They
got
get
back
big.
to
They
England.
want
The rest were shot. The first 50, they were one at a time and shot in the back of the head. And Hitler wanted to kill all of them. And then he wanted to kill all of the prisoners of war. Actually put out the order not too long after that to kill the whole thing, and they didn't take it. So that's why I call it a disaster, because it created the difficulty of us. One thing to get out of the camp is one thing. None to get out of Germany. You had to get to Switzerland or Sweden or
That's the one you got away.
Spain, and so it was tougher to do that. The only good thing that happened, the 50 Gestapo agents that shot these guys were all found after the war. As far as I know, all of them. Treated at the Nuremberg trials, and all of them were hung or put in jail for life.
So even if a movie is technically correct or correct at the detail level, the big picture just doesn't match.
Well, they didn't show. They sweetened it up a little bit. They had that racetrack with the motorcycle. What's his name?
You mean Steve McQueen wasn't in your Stalag?
No.
It was pretty accurate up till that ending, that Hollywood ending. But as far as how the guys, the ones that really escaped, the 3 of them, they knew every piece of bark on those trees up there. They were the only 3 that was destined to escape to begin with.
What about you guys? Is there a theatrical film out there that in any way accurately represents your experiences on the fighter side or the bomber side?
I have a film that was made by, I've forgotten his name now, but one of the big newscasters, Edward R. Murrow. It was made by him. And this film depicts the first raid made from Africa into Ploesti, and 2 or 3 raids after that, including one that was made by P-38s, which you may have been on. And that depicted the war very well, but that was a documentary type of a film. It had no plot or anything like that. It was just what happens when these planes made their raids from the different areas. And that depicts the raids very definitely in the right direction, authentic, very authentic.
I think the flags of our father depicted what went on in Okinawa and so forth, and good. I sat 15 minutes afterwards with the tears running down in the dark until but it was certainly, people would look, if they looked at it, would understand that part of war, which is not a good training.
Let me ask you a yes or no. Would you do it again?
Damn right.
You bet.
I wouldn't want to, but I would.
I'd love to.
I would love to.
And a little more complicated one that I'm almost embarrassed to say has to be asked, because I think there's only one answer to this, but it's your answer that counts, not mine. Was it worth it?
Oh, definitely.
Oh, definitely.
Oh,
worth it.
definitely.
the war
I don't
worth it?
think there's no question there.
Oh, you can't study that war without being positive that we would have been speaking German.
Absolutely.
Right.
For sure.
It was absolutely necessary, and that's what made that 120 million I talk about back here in the States backing us up.
I talk to kids in school, and once in a while I get a question, and I can tell it came from the family. Was the dropping of the atomic bomb morality right? And I said, yes, it was. A little middle school girl asked me that. I said, you probably wouldn't be sitting there if it wouldn't be. She says, why? I said, because your grandparents would still be buried over there in Japan somewhere, because of the people we would have lost trying to take the island of Japan without dropping the atom bomb.
Yeah.
It had to be dropped. And the general from Japan who had helped direct the war in a paper the last 3 or 4 years, and you may have seen it, he said that gave them an excuse to give up. He said without this back to fall on, they would never have given up, because they just didn't give up. And he said that gave them an excuse to give up, was the atom bomb.
Well, you'd have a different show, because you'd have a different host, because my father was on the West Virginia, and there's no way that would have made it through the kamikazes.
Yeah.
So with a couple of minutes left, you have messages for today's war fighters and the country at large. What would you like them to know?
Well, I wear this red band on my arm here, and it was given to me by the VFW to wear, and it says on there, I support our troops. And I definitely support our troops, and I think all of our people in this country should do that too. Whether we have a good or a bad president, the president is our president, and what he's doing is in the right direction as far as the president goes, and let's support our people and our troops.
If you don't like him, vote him out next time. That's the way to do it.
That's correct.
You voted for him. Now, when you get ready to get rid of him, vote him out.
Correct.
Very good point. Very good point. I agree with. We should support those troops no matter what. And it doesn't seem like a lot of people have that same.
Don't let Pelosi
No.
loose. They won't. They'll cut that, won't they?
Oh, no, I don't think so. You can be as specific as you'd like. You've earned the right. Don't you think?
I don't want to disturb things.
I'd say cut her loose out there in the middle of the Pacific.
Yeah, I think the whole political system has to be evaluated how we're going to do it.
Amen. I
And
agree
think
with that
that's,
one.
That's the main issue, and I can't see the leader yet, in my opinion, that's ready to take it on and basically form a new party. Whether he's the lead in it or not, I don't know that.
I think that's coming. I think that's coming.
Yeah, I
Well,
think
gentlemen, what's also coming, believe it or not, is the end of our hour. Right at this intriguing moment where we're going to fix the political problems in the U.S. And I want to thank you for your service.
Thank you for the nice.
You're welcome. I want to thank you for being on this show. There's more hours we can do. Maybe we'll get a chance to do it if we're fortunate. And I hope it was as enjoyable for the four of you as it was for me. It was an honor.
I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Thank you for watching.
We also got to tell Bill about the Texans. I never told him that story.
Well, we could keep talking about Texans forever. There's no way. I mean, that's one of the things that I was amazed in the Marine Corps. I joined the Marine. I'm from New Jersey.
Oh, yeah.
I joined the Marine Corps. Everybody's either from Texas or Pennsylvania.